In the quiet hours, when the candles burn low, tell me which city you're listening from. And if these chronicles call to you, subscribe, so you don't lose the thread when the next page turns. The gods have temples, but we have memory. And memory, in Faerun, is a kind of power. The oldest fear is not of steel, it is not of fire, it is not even of death. The oldest fear is of a truth the gods cannot unlearn. In the realms, divinity is not only a force, it is a relationship. A god may be older than kingdoms, yet still be bound to a fragile tether. Worship offered by mouths that can fall silent, belief held by hearts that can change, and a name carried by tongues that can forget. That dependence is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. Io's order, the hidden architecture of the heavens, does not merely grant the gods their stations. It defines the terms under which they may keep them. Power in Faerun is not a crown placed once and worn forever. It is a mantle that must be sustained. Some deities have learned to move like currents beneath the world, present in 10,000 small moments rather than in one towering miracle. Others have sought dominance, demanding obedience, trying to choke choice at its root. But all of them, gentle or cruel, share the same silent vulnerability. Mortals are the ones who decide where the river of faith flows. And mortals are not consistent. A harvest fails. A city burns. A child dies in a plague. The priest's promises sound thinner. The old prayers grow stale. The god does not fade because a rival slew them in the sky. The god fades because mortals begin to look elsewhere. Sometimes they turn to another altar. Sometimes they turn away from altars entirely. In that moment, a divine being, an immortal intelligence of radiant will, has no perfect defense. Not because they lack might, but because might is not the lever that controls faith. In the earliest ages, the gods behaved as though mortals were simply clay, shaped, commanded, corrected, punished. It took time and disaster for divinity to understand the dangerous thing living inside mortal souls. Choice. Not the simple choice of which king to serve or which road to travel. The deeper choice. What is worthy of reverence? What is true? What deserves sacrifice? What name should be spoken when the night becomes unbearable? Even the most powerful god cannot force that choice to be genuine. They can terrify, they can bribe, they can deceive, they can send visions that make the mind tremble. But coerced worship is unstable worship. It is a flame fed by fear, bright, hungry, and quick to die the moment the fear changes shape. This is why the gods do not truly fear mortal armies. Armies can be crushed, cities can be drowned, nations can be erased. The gods have done such things and watched history smooth the scars. What they fear is the mortal capacity to redirect meaning. There are moments in Faerun's long record when the heavens seem to lean closer to the world, listening, not to prayers, but to the way mortals speak when no priest is present. The casual oaths, the whispered curses, the stories told over ale and grief. These are not small things, they are the roots, and the roots decide which divine tree survives the winter. This is not mere philosophy. The realms has proven it in blood and in silence. Consider what it means that gods possess portfolios, bound domains of influence like magic, death, war, storms, love, tyranny, trickery, knowledge. These are not simply titles. They are the lanes in which divine power is permitted to move. A god cannot be everything. Io's order will not allow it. A god must be something, specifically, and remain within those borders, or pay for transgression. That limitation is often misunderstood as weakness. It is not. It is structure. But structure can be exploited. A mortal does not need to match a god in raw power. A mortal only needs to learn the shape of the rules. Here the fear deepens, because mortals have always been the greatest students of boundaries. Their lives are short. Their time is precious. They learn quickly what a thing is, what it is not, and how to make the space between those definitions serve them. When mortals first began to build civilizations that outlasted a single ruler's breath, the gods watched with interest, then with pride, then with suspicion. Because civilization changes worship. A nomad prays to the storm for mercy because the storm can kill them before dawn. A city dweller prays for law, for protection, for trade, for order. Temples rise, hierarchies form, doctrine hardens, the god becomes more present and more distant at the same time, filtered through institutions that can be corrupted, challenged, or replaced. And once worship becomes organized, it becomes political. If a temple can gather coins, it can gather influence. If it can gather influence, it can shape what people believe the god wants. Soon the god is no longer simply receiving faith. The god is receiving a constructed image of themselves, an idea built by mortal hands. That image may strengthen them. It may also trap them. Here is the mid-part truth that turns the key. The gods are not only dependent on faith, they are dependent on interpretation. A god may embody war, but what does war mean to mortals this century? Glory, survival, conquest, liberation. The portfolio remains, but its mortal meaning shifts like sand. And in that shift, a god's expression changes because the channel through which their power is poured has been reshaped. This is why divine fear is not always loud. Sometimes it appears as subtle interference, omens, chosen champions, carefully timed miracles, dogma spread like a net across a region before a rival can root there. Not because the god is panicking, gods do not panic like mortals, but because the god understands that the battlefield is not the sky, it is the mind. And minds, unlike mountains, can move overnight. It is tempting to believe the gods are safe because they are immortal. But immortality in Faerûn is not invulnerability. A god can be diminished. A god can be cast down. A god can be slain. And even when they are not slain, they can be forgotten. Forgotten is the word that matters. Because the ultimate end for many divinities is not a heroic death in celestial fire. It is obscurity. It is becoming a half-remembered name on a crumbling shrine, a whispered epithet in a backwater village, a story told as superstition rather than reverence. There are powers in the realms that were once worshipped and now linger as vestiges, shadows of divinity, echoes that cannot fully step back into the world because the bridge of belief has collapsed. That fate haunts the gods more than any sword, so they watch mortals. They cultivate mortal heroes, not purely out of love, but out of necessity. They offer boons. They send dreams. They turn certain bloodlines into instruments. They encourage wars that swell devotion. They encourage peace that stabilizes worship. Each move is a quiet admission. Mortals are not pieces. Mortals are the board. And every so often, the board tilts. It begins with something small, a charismatic prophet, a new doctrine, a cult that offers answers the temple does not, a ruler who decides that one god will be favored and another quietly outlawed. In those decisions, made in council chambers and alleyways, a god's future can be rewritten without a single thunderbolt. The gods fear mortals because mortals are unpredictable, because mortals can suffer and still sing, because mortals can lose everything and still decide what matters, because mortals can call a god benevolent one century and tyrannical the next, without the god changing at all. And in that judgment lies the unsettling balance of Faerûn. The gods rule the heavens, but mortals decide who the heavens belong to. That is not rebellion. That is the design. And once you see it, you understand why the divine gaze never fully leaves the world below, not even for a moment. There are tales in the realms that sound like warnings told to frighten children. Gods punished for pride, mortals struck down for daring to reach too high. But the deeper record suggests something colder. The gods were not merely angry, they were alarmed. Because the realms has seen mortals do something that should have been impossible. They have interrupted the divine, not by prayer, not by blasphemy, by craft. Long before the great modern nations drew their borders, before Cormyr's purple dragon flew over stone keeps, before Waterdeep became a crown of trade, there was an empire that treated the gods the way a mason treats weather, a factor to be engineered against. Imaskar rose with a confidence that did not ask permission from heaven. Their arcanists did not kneel. They calculated, and they built barriers the gods could feel. In the oldest accounts, the Imaskari worked art so advanced it blurred the boundary between spell and infrastructure. Wards layered into their realm like invisible stone, shaping reality the way a dam shapes a river. One of the most unsettling truths in their legacy is not that they defied the gods. It is that their defiance functioned. They created protections that hindered divine access, preventing deities from freely reaching their subjects within the empire. In a world where gods are accustomed to answering prayers with presence, visions, omens, direct intervention, Imaskar attempted something radical, the severing of the line, a mortal empire trying to place itself beyond the reach of divinity. This is where the fear becomes more than philosophical. The gods can endure insults. They can endure disbelief in a single city. But a mortal method for blocking the divine is a different kind of threat. It suggests that worship is not the only bridge between realms. It suggests there are other bridges, built by mortal hands, and bridges can be burned. Here is the mid-part anchor that shifts everything. Imaskar's greatest sin was not arrogance but demonstration. They demonstrated that divine does not mean unrestricted, and once something has been demonstrated, it becomes repeatable in principle, even if the exact method is lost. Imaskar did not stop at isolation. When the gods were held at bay, the empire turned outward, toward acquisition. Slavery was the engine, conquest was the appetite, and in their hunger for labor and resources, the Imaskari reached into worlds beyond their own. They took humans from other worlds. This is not legend spoken by drunken sailors. It is a foundational trauma in the histories of several peoples of Faerun. The assertion that the Imaskari brought humans to Toril through planar means, seizing them as a workforce, uprooting cultures as one might uproot a tree. Those humans carried with them their old faiths, names of gods who were not native to Imaskar's control. The Imaskari tried to keep those gods out as well. But faith is difficult to quarantine. It survives in secret, in whispered prayers, in the stubborn rituals of captive hearts. When enslaved people remember a god, the god hears, even if the empire tries to muffle the sound. And when a god hears, a god searches for a way in. The gods did not simply watch this in distant outrage. They looked for openings, and in time, openings were found, not always through force, but through the imperfections of mortal systems. The more total the control, the more catastrophic the failure when a crack appears. The realms remembers what came after as divine retribution, and so it was. Yet even that vengeance contains a hidden admission. The gods could not simply stroll into Imaskar and shatter it at will. They needed access. They needed a path. They needed the mortal world to give them purchase. That is the uncomfortable pattern. Mortals build cages. Gods look for keys. This is why the gods fear mortal ingenuity. It turns metaphysics into engineering. A ward is not an argument. It is a structure. It does not care whether a god is righteous. It cares whether the correct conditions are met. And mortals, unlike gods, are obsessed with conditions. They thrive on the question of how. How to bind. How to channel. How to constrain. A god's will can be immense, but Ao's laws are older than will. A god cannot always do what they desire, because the cosmos itself resists. Mortals, however, often live at the edge of those resistances, testing them like fingers pressing against ice to find the thin place. So when the gods look upon mortal civilizations, they do not merely see worshippers, they see laboratories. They see societies where knowledge accumulates, where spells become safer, then stronger, where each generation inherits the best of the last and adds a blade's width more. In time, that accumulation becomes a ladder. And ladders are what gods do not like mortals to build. Because a ladder implies ascent. It implies that the distance between flesh and divinity is not infinite, only difficult. Imaskar's story, even in its ruin, left the realms with a lingering chill. The gods can be resisted, not by equal power, but by clever design. The divine can be delayed. Divinity can be inconvenienced. And once mortals learn they can inconvenience a god, they begin to wonder what else they can do. That is where fear becomes strategic. Gods begin to cultivate priesthoods that discourage certain kinds of study. They encourage taboos. They sanctify ignorance where ignorance keeps the world safe for them. They elevate myths that frame arcane ambition as inevitable catastrophe. Because sometimes, in Faerûn, it is. But the gods cannot fully stop mortal curiosity. Curiosity is one of the few forces that does not require permission. And in the next age of mortal greatness, curiosity would rise so high that the heavens would feel it like a knife held at the throat of reality itself. Not because mortals hated the gods, but because mortals discovered that the rules could be reached and touched. Imaskar proved the gods could be resisted by design. Netheril proved something worse, that a mortal mind, given time and height, could reach into the divine machinery itself. Netheril did not begin as a threat. It began as a refuge. Humans taught by elves, raised in the long shadow of older peoples, learning the art not as a weapon but as a language. Then the language became a profession, then an economy, then a ladder, and Netheril climbed. The floating enclaves were not merely feats of spellcraft. They were a declaration that the world's laws could be negotiated. Mythalars, vast engines of sustained magic, made permanence out of what had once been fleeting. Arcanists no longer begged for miracles, they manufactured them. That was the first quiet revelation the gods could not ignore. When mortals can produce wonders on demand, divine favor stops feeling necessary. Temples still stood, prayers were still spoken, but the center of gravity shifted. In Netheril, power looked less like devotion and more like mastery, and worship, where it persisted, often became a cultural habit rather than a desperate need. Then came the second revelation, sharper and more dangerous. Netheril's greatest archwizards were not merely learning spells, they were learning limits. They mapped the boundaries of magic with the same attention a sailor gives reefs and currents. They catalogued what could be done and what could not. And the moment a mortal begins to treat cosmic law as a set of parameters, the gods are no longer the only ones who understand the system. The crisis that haunts every divine memory of that age has a name that still tastes like ash in the histories. Karsus. He was not the first mortal to dream of impossible things, but he was the one who tried to seize the impossible with a spell. Karsus's avatar was not a prayer, and not a bargain. It was an act of arcane replacement, an attempt to take the power and station of a god directly. And he aimed not at a minor divinity, but at the foundation beneath all spellcasting, the goddess of magic. Here is the mid-part anchor, the moment that redefines the entire relationship between gods and mortals. Mistral died to stop him, not in a poetic metaphor, in the blunt reality of cosmic triage. The goddess of magic severed herself, sacrificed her own existence, because allowing Karsus to hold that power, even briefly, would have unraveled magic across the world in a way that could not be repaired. The spell worked for an instant. That instant was enough. Karsus did not become a stable god. He became a mortal mind drowning in an ocean too vast to comprehend. Magic faltered. The mythalors failed. Enclaves that had hovered like God's own islands fell from the sky, and Netheryl's greatness shattered on the stones of its own ambition. What the gods learned was not merely that mortals can be punished. They learned that mortals can force the gods into losing choices. Maestral's death was a kind of divine wound that no thunderbolt could prevent. In that act, the heavens were compelled to acknowledge a brutal truth. The most dangerous mortal is not the one who swings a sword at a temple. It is the one who understands the hidden supports holding reality up. Afterward, the new Mistra rose, and the rules tightened. The art was constrained. The highest tiers of mortal spellcasting became forbidden, not simply by mortal law or cultural taboo, but by the structure of magic itself. Because the cosmos had already watched what happens when a single mortal hand grips the wrong lever. Netheryl's fall is often told as a morality tale about hubris. It is that, but it is also something else, a proof of concept. Mortals can reach high enough to endanger what even gods depend upon. And when that happens, the gods do not merely retaliate. They adapt, they restrict, they guard the system, because they have seen the cost of letting mortal brilliance run without rails. The lesson settles heavily when you look at the ruins. The gods fear mortals because mortals can break the world in ways that force even divinity to bleed to keep it whole. Netheryl's fall did not end mortal ambition. It refined it. The gods would have preferred a lesson that frightened mortals back into humility, but fear does not erase knowledge. The ruins of the enclaves became a scattered scripture of warning, and warnings are often studied as instructions by the wrong kind of student. In the centuries that followed, the art did not forget Karsus. It remembered him like a scar remembers the blade. Mistra's tightening of magic, her shaping of the weave into safer channels, was meant to prevent a second catastrophe. Yet that very act revealed something mortals had not fully understood before. Magic is governed. It has architecture. It can be adjusted. And anything with architecture can be tested. The gods fear mortals most when mortals begin to treat the divine order as a system with levers, not a mystery with borders. That shift is subtle. It happens quietly in academies, in hidden towers, in the margins of grimoires where an archmage writes a single line that should not exist. If this rule exists, it can be approached. In Faerun, there are always those who approach. Some do it for conquest, some for salvation, some for obsession so pure it becomes its own god. One of the deepest fears among the divine is not that mortals will attack them head-on, but that mortals will learn how to attack what the gods are made of, worship, portfolios, and the stability of the world that makes worship possible. Because the gods do not float above reality like distant stars. They are embedded in it. A god's portfolio is not simply a subject they enjoy. It is their lane of existence. It is the shape of their authority and the texture of their presence. When mortals reshape the meaning of a portfolio, when they redefine war, death, love, tyranny, magic, they are not merely changing culture. They are altering the language divinity speaks through. Here is the mid-part anchor, the quiet turning point that transforms the entire theme of gods fearing mortals. In the realms, a god can be weakened not only by loss of worship, but by loss of relevance. When mortals stop associating certain experiences with certain deities, the gods do not simply lose prayers. They lose purchase. Their grip on the world becomes less precise. Their miracles become less natural to the minds receiving them. Their presence becomes easier to ignore. Mortals can do that without ever declaring war. A new philosophy spreads through a city. A kingdom reforms its laws. A priesthood fractures into rival sects, each insisting the god's will means something different. Suddenly, the same divine power that once united becomes contested, and contest breeds dilution. The gods cannot fully prevent this, not without breaking the rules that keep them gods. Because there is one limit the divine cannot escape. Mortal minds must freely choose to believe. Even the cruelest deities understand this. Tyranny can create obedience, but it does not always create devotion. Bane learned that lesson more than once, watching empires bend while faith remained brittle. Others learned it in subtler ways, through heresies, schisms, and the slow drift of cultures that no longer needed an old god to explain the world. And when mortal societies grow strong, they often stop needing explanations. They start wanting control. That is why arcane power, political power, and divine power have always braided together in Faerun. The strongest gods thrive in eras where mortals feel small, when storms are terrifying, plagues are mysterious, and death is a door without a handle. But when mortals feel capable, when their cities are lit, their medicine improves, their spellcraft becomes routine, the divine must work harder to remain central. This is why miracles are not merely gifts. They are statements. A god does not only heal a wound. A god reminds the living that healing has a source beyond mortal hands. A god does not only grant victory. A god claims the story of that victory as evidence of divine relevance. Mortals, in response, do what mortals always do. They test the story. They ask whether the healing could have happened without the temple, whether the victory was strategy, not providence, whether the god truly mattered. These questions are not spoken in thunder. They are spoken in kitchens, in taverns, in the private doubt between one heartbeat and the next. And doubt is the slowest poison a god can drink. Yet the god's fear does not end with philosophy. There is a more immediate, darker anxiety woven through divine memory, that mortals have not only threatened the structure of magic once, they have threatened the divine seat itself. Because in Faerun, the line between mortal and god is not a wall, it is a threshold. The gods remember Netheril as the age when a mortal tried to seize the most essential portfolio in existence and forced the goddess of magic to die to stop him. They remember it as proof that mortal hands can reach the crown. So when a mortal rises, when a champion gathers legends like armor, when a mage gathers spells like weapons, when a tyrant gathers fear like incense, the heavens do not merely watch with curiosity, they watch with calculation. Not because they are uncertain of their power in a duel, but because they have learned the most frightening thing about mortals. Mortals do not always aim at the gods. Sometimes they aim at the rules that keep gods alive. And when that happens, even a divine victory can feel like loss, because the world itself is the thing at risk. The gods learned, after Netheril, that catastrophe does not always come as conquest. Sometimes it comes as collateral. A mortal does not need to overthrow a deity in open battle to terrify the heavens. A mortal only needs to damage something the gods cannot easily replace: continuity. The stable rhythm of prayer. The predictability of mortal belief. The systems, magical and cultural, that let divine power move cleanly through the world. Because divinity in Faerun is not only power possessed, it is power transmitted, and transmission depends on channels. For Maestra, that channel is the weave, the living structure that makes spellcasting possible in the forms most mortals recognize. For other gods, the channel is doctrine, ritual, temple authority, tradition, fear, love, duty. Whatever binds mortals to a portfolio so tightly that it feels natural to pray. When those channels break, gods do not merely lose influence. They lose clarity. Their will becomes harder to express. Their presence becomes easier to doubt. Here is the turning truth that the gods rarely speak aloud. The realms can survive a fallen city more easily than it can survive a broken foundation. That is why Karsus's attempt was so horrifying. It threatened the foundation beneath magic itself, and the gods have seen echoes of that danger more than once. Proof that reality's supports can be struck again, even if the hand that strikes is not aiming at the gods at all. In later ages, when Maestra was slain and the spell plague tore across Toril, the lesson returned in a new shape. If the structure of magic collapses, everything tied to it convulses. Kingdoms, wards, bargains, protections, even the daily assumptions mortals use to navigate life. In that chaos, worship does not remain steady. It splinters into panic, blame, desperate new cults, and furious rejection of old faiths that suddenly feel powerless. The gods do not fear mortal victory. They fear mortal disruption, because disruption spreads faster than doctrine. A single mortal act, an assassination, a betrayal, an arcane breach, can ripple outward until whole regions lose their sense of order. And once mortals feel that order is gone, they do what they have always done in the dark. They rewrite their beliefs to match the world they think they now inhabit. This is why divine beings cultivate stability with almost obsessive care. They elevate chosen servants. They bind their churches with hierarchy. They preserve rites and calendars. They fight heresy not only because heresy is insulting, but because heresy fractures the vessel that holds faith. A god can endure hatred. Hatred is still attention. Hatred still acknowledges a name. But a god cannot easily endure irrelevance. There is another quiet fear beneath all the grand calamities: that mortals will decide the gods are not required. Not in a single dramatic declaration, but in the slow drift of generations who learn to solve problems without prayer, who treat miracles as rumors, who see the divine as distant myth rather than living presence. And when that drift accelerates, when crisis makes mortals feel abandoned, or progress makes them feel self-sufficient, the gods face a threat no army can answer. Not the threat of being slain, the threat of being left behind. So the heavens guard their power in a way mortals often misunderstand. They do not only defend their temples and their priests. They defend the channels that make worship possible, the order of magic, the stability of meaning, the fragile trust that keeps mortals speaking divine names with anything resembling conviction. Because in Faerûn, the most dangerous mortal is not always the one who reaches for godhood. Sometimes it is the one who breaks the world so thoroughly that belief itself cannot remain intact. For most mortals, the gods are distant, seen in symbols, felt in omens, argued over in temples, invoked in fear. They are immense, but abstract. Then came a time when abstraction bled, when the heavens were forced into the mud of the world, and every mortal with eyes could see what the gods spend eras trying to hide. Divinity can be made vulnerable. The time of troubles did not begin as a mortal revolt. It began as a cosmic judgment. Ao, the overgod, cast down the deities of Faerûn, forcing them to walk Toril in avatar forms, stripped of much of their divine power and cut off from their planes, unless they could reclaim what had been stolen. The gods were made finite, and mortals witnessed something that should never have been witnessed. Gods afraid. Not in the way mortals fear death, but in the way a ruler fears exposure. In the way a living myth fears becoming merely a creature with a wound. Temples that once spoke with absolute confidence suddenly trembled. Clerics found their spells unreliable. Faith became a test, not a comfort. In some places, panic swelled into riots as people realized the certainty of the heavens had cracked. Here is the mid-part anchor, the pivot that changes everything. During the time of troubles, gods could die, truly die, at mortal hands. Not as distant metaphysics, as witnessed history. Mystra was slain in that era, her death sending shock through the art itself and reshaping the way magic would function afterward. Other divine powers fell as well. Mortals did not merely pray to the gods. Mortals fought beside them, against them, sometimes not even fully understanding what they were facing until it bled. This was not simply humiliation. It was instruction. For the gods, the time of troubles was a forced lesson in dependence. When they walked the world, their survival was tied to mortal choices in a way that felt unbearable. They needed allies. They needed worship. They needed mortal shelter, mortal information, mortal hands to open doors and hold lines. And mortals learned the reverse lesson. The gods could be cornered. That knowledge does not fade. It embeds itself into cultures like a buried blade. After the gods returned to their planes and the immediate crisis passed, the realms did not go back to innocence. The old awe remained, but it was no longer pure. There was a new undertone in every prayer. The awareness that a god is not only a cosmic principle, but an entity that can be harmed. The divine fear sharpened because the divine understood what the mortals now carried. Not just the memory of divine power, but the memory of divine weakness. This is why, after the time of troubles, the gods became more careful in the way they touched the world. Their faiths grew more guarded, more political, more conscious of reputations and narratives. Because when mortals have seen gods fall, mortals begin to judge gods not as inevitabilities, but as rulers who can be measured and replaced. And replacement is not theory in Faerûn. Ao did not cast down the gods to make mortals proud. He did it to enforce cosmic order. Yet the consequence was unavoidable. Mortals were given proof that divinity is not immune to consequence. In the old days, the gods could rely on mystery to protect them. If the heavens are unknowable, then the gods feel unassailable. But once mortals have seen a god stagger and bleed, mystery becomes thinner, and thin mystery is dangerous. Because it invites questions that gods do not like mortals to ask with confidence. How much of a god's power comes from worship? How much from a portfolio? How much from Ao's permission? If a god can fall once, could it happen again? If the heavens can be shaken, could mortals learn to shake them deliberately? The time of troubles answered these questions without ever speaking them aloud. It did not promise mortals that they could win against the gods. It proved that the gods could lose. And after that, the fear in the heavens was never quite the same, because the most frightening thing in Faerûn is not an enemy with power. It is an enemy who has learned that the divine can bleed, and still chooses to reach for the knife. After the time of troubles, the gods tried to restore distance. They returned to their planes, reclaimed their domains, and resumed the older posture of permanence. But the realms could not be made unknowing again. Mortals had seen divinity walking the roads like any other traveler, wounded, hungry, hunted, bargaining for shelter and loyalty. And then something happened that turned that memory into a weapon. The world watched mortals take the vacant thrones. Not in fable, in recorded history. Midnight, mortal, determined, scarred by the chaos of that era, rose to become maestra after the death of the previous goddess of magic. It was not a simple reward, and it was not a comfortable coronation. It was a transfer of cosmic burden. The weave needed a steward, and the realms learned that the steward could be born in a cradle. A mortal became the anchor of magic itself. That is the first cut. The second is sharper. Because Midnight's ascent did not only prove that mortals can rise, it proved that the gods can be replaced without the cosmos ending, so long as the role is filled. Divinity is not merely a person, it is a function. A seat with responsibilities and constraints. The heavens do not always care who sits there, only that someone does. This is the kind of truth gods prefer mortals to never articulate. And then came the more troubling example. Cyric, a mortal who rose amid the wreckage, who wore faith like a stolen cloak, who gathered power not through wisdom but through appetite and grievance. His ascent into divinity was not a moral triumph. It was a warning written in living ink. The divine realm is not protected from mortal instability. A mortal can enter it carrying every human flaw, paranoia, vanity, cruelty, and those flaws do not vanish when the mantle is taken. They are amplified. Here is the mid-part anchor, the turning point that reframes everything the gods fear. Once mortals know ascension is real, every extraordinary mortal becomes a possible future deity. Not merely a hero, not merely a prophet, a candidate. That changes how the gods look at mortals of power. A rising warlord is no longer just a threat to kingdoms. They are a potential rival portfolio. A legendary assassin is no longer just a danger to rulers. They are a seed of murder as worship. A visionary mage is not merely ambitious. They are a hand reaching toward the architecture of the cosmos again. And it changes how mortals look at themselves. Because the distance between prayer and sovereignty narrows. Worship becomes not only devotion, but investment. An act of choosing who might someday stand above the world. Faith becomes political in the most literal sense. When mortals decide which stories become sacred, they are deciding which beings will have power tomorrow. The gods, in response, do what they always do when the ground shifts beneath them. They compete. They nurture chosen champions more aggressively. They guard their churches more tightly. They punish schisms more fiercely. They intervene in mortal affairs with subtler hands. Because overt force risks backlash, and backlash risks disbelief, and disbelief risks starvation. Even benevolent gods understand the danger, not because they fear justice, but because they fear precedent. If one mortal rose, others can rise. If one god can be replaced, the concept of replacement spreads, and once replacement becomes imaginable, loyalty becomes negotiable. A mortal who believes a god is eternal will endure much in that god's name. A mortal who believes a god can be traded out like a failed ruler will endure far less. So the gods fear mortals not simply because mortals can harm them, but because mortals can succeed them. Mortals can inherit divinity the way a dynasty inherits a throne, sometimes with honor, sometimes with blood on their hands, always with consequences. And the realms, having watched midnight rise and Sirik claw his way upward, can no longer pretend the boundary is a wall. It is a door. The gods are afraid because mortals have learned where the door is. When mortals learn that divinity can be inherited, the next question is never spoken in temples, but it spreads anyway. Inherited from whom? And taken how? Some ascensions look almost like destiny wearing a mortal face. Others look like burglary committed against the heavens. The dead three belong to the second kind: Bane, Paul, Mirkul. They are remembered as gods of tyranny, murder, and death, but their true significance to this question is not the darkness of their portfolios. It is the method by which they rose. They did not simply become powerful mortals. They became proof that the divine order can be forced open by will, violence, and opportunism. In the centuries before their apotheosis, they moved through the realms as mortals with extraordinary ambition, gathering followers not as a comfort, but as infrastructure. Their cults were not built to worship existing gods. They were built to manufacture the conditions of godhood. That is the first unsettling revelation. Faith can be engineered. A priesthood can be designed like a machine. Recruitment, ritual, fear, reward, secrecy, until belief becomes less like a spontaneous flame and more like a controlled burn. The gods have always known this, but the dead three showed how far it can go when the goal is not devotion, but ascent. They did not preach humility. They preached inevitability. They did not offer salvation. They offered power to those who served, and terror to those who resisted. And in a world where mortals die quickly, terror spreads faster than wisdom. Then comes the deeper implication. The portfolios they claimed were not accidental. Tyranny thrives when people feel unsafe. Murder thrives when law's fragile. Death thrives always, but it thrives most when a culture becomes obsessed with its shadow. The dead three rose by aligning themselves with forces mortals cannot ignore, and by persuading mortals that these forces deserved names, faces, and altars. In doing so, they turned mortal fear into divine fuel. Here is the mid-part anchor, the moment that changes the weight of their story. The dead three demonstrate that the gods do not only fear mortal brilliance, they fear mortal appetite. Because appetite does not require understanding. It only requires desire, and desire recruits. A mortal mage like Karsus threatened the structure of magic by reaching too high. The dead three threatened the structure of divinity by reaching too widely, weaponizing common human impulses and binding them into organized worship. They made a theology out of what people already did in the dark: dominate, kill, and mourn. And once those impulses are sanctified, they become self-sustaining. This is why their legend echoes in every divine court, even among gods who despise them. If three mortals could seize portfolios so fundamental, if they could gather belief through coercion and reshape the heavens around their rise, then the gods must accept a truth that is hard to hold. The divine realm does not automatically select for virtue. It selects for survivable worship. The Dead Three also revealed another pressure point in the system. Faith does not have to be loving to be effective. A frightened population can pray as reliably as a devoted one. In some ways, more reliably. Love is complicated. Fear is simple. So even when their power waned in later ages, the lesson remained. The gods cannot fully eradicate the possibility that mortals will attempt the same path, because the path is not hidden behind a single secret spell. It is built from human nature. A tyrant who teaches their subjects to equate obedience with holiness is already laying a divine foundation. An assassin's creed that turns murder into sacrament is already sketching the shape of a portfolio. A death cult that convinces the grieving that the grave is the only honest truth is already feeding something that can grow into a god. The Dead Three did not merely become deities. They proved that mortals can convert raw human impulses into a divine economy. And that is the kind of power the gods cannot comfortably police, because it begins in hearts long before it becomes a temple. In the end, the realms does not fear them only because they are evil. The realms fears what they revealed. The gods are not separated from mortals by purity or destiny, but by thresholds. And mortals, when they want something badly enough, have always been willing to step over thresholds. There is a comforting lie many priesthoods have told for centuries, that gods are fixed and mortals are the variable, that the heavens are the constant and the world below is only weather. Faerun's history does not support that lie, because mortals do not merely serve the gods. Mortals define the conditions under which gods remain coherent. A temple can be burned and rebuilt. A saint can die and be replaced by another name on another altar. But when a belief changes shape, when a culture decides that mercy is weakness, or that law is oppression, or that death is liberation, the portfolio itself becomes a different doorway. The God remains, but the way mortals reach that God has shifted, and the shift matters. A single doctrinal fracture can do what an army cannot. Schism is not dramatic like war. It is slow. It begins as disagreement in a cloister, then becomes whispered accusation, then becomes a rival chapel down the street, then becomes two communities who use the same holy symbol but mean different things by it. The God at the center receives devotion, yes, but devotion now carries conflicting definitions. The channel splinters, the power becomes less clean, and sometimes mortals do not splinter a faith by accident. Sometimes they weaponize belief deliberately. Here is the mid-part anchor, the canon proof that makes divine fear feel rational. Sarik's faith once spread not only through cult and murder, but through a book. The Sirenishad was crafted to turn minds towards Sirik, to bend readers into devotion, as if belief could be hammered into shape. That detail is easy to miss, because it sounds like mere villainy. It is something worse. It reveals that faith can be treated like a targeted spell, not a miracle, not a personal awakening, a mechanism. The gods fear mechanisms in mortal hands, because mechanisms do not care about justice, they care about function. When mortals learn to manufacture devotion through enforced doctrine, through propaganda sanctified as scripture, through political control of temples, they begin to manipulate the very currency the gods live on. A ruler who declares one god state-approved and another heretical is not only choosing theology, they are redirecting a river. And rivers carve landscapes whether mountains like it or not. Empires rise and fall, and with them rise and fall the gods those empires carried at their heart. Conquest spreads not only banners, but calendars, holy days, and rituals. Then the empire breaks, and the faith breaks with it, fracturing into local cults, rival interpretations, and bitter memory. The gods endure, but their map changes. Their influence becomes uneven, contested, negotiated. What terrifies the divine is that none of this requires a god's consent. A people can decide a god is no longer worthy. A generation can decide an old doctrine feels hollow. A catastrophe can convince a city that their patron failed them, and the gods cannot simply force admiration back into existence, not without turning worship into something brittle, something that shatters the moment the pressure lifts. So the battlefield shifts again, not in the sky, not in the plains, but in the mundane places where belief is formed. Courts, schools, markets, families, funerals. Mortals reshape the language of meaning, and the gods must either adapt to that language or lose their hold on it. In the end, the gods do not fear mortals because mortals can deny them with one loud proclamation. They fear mortals because mortals can reinterpret them, quietly, until the divine is no longer what it was, and cannot remain what it was, without fading. The gods of Faerun are ancient, but they are not the authors of everything. They did not write the whole world from nothing and then step back to admire it. They inhabit a structure older than their personal will, shaped by laws that even divinity must obey. And the most decisive law is not carved in celestial stone. It lives in mortals, because mortals are the hinge upon which divinity swings, toward strength or toward starvation, toward clarity or toward dilution, toward permanence or toward replacement. That truth is not a moral judgment. It is the architecture of the realms. When you gather the strands, Imaskar's wards that hindered divine reach, Netheral's spell that forced a goddess to die to save reality, the time of troubles that made gods bleed in the streets, the ascensions that proved thrones can be filled by mortal hands, the dead three turning fear into fuel, the shaping of belief into mechanisms like the Sirenishad. You do not see random crises. You see a pattern. Mortals are the only force in Faerun that can threaten the gods without needing to match them in raw power. Not because mortals are secretly greater, but because mortals control the only resource the gods cannot forge: genuine belief. The gods can create wonders, yes. They can send angels, chosen, signs, storms, but they cannot reach into a mortal heart and make love, reverence, or conviction real by decree. They can compel obedience. They can inspire awe. They cannot manufacture faith that lasts. Here is the final anchor. The heavy conclusion the realms keeps learning the hard way. A god's immortality is conditional. Conditional on worship, conditional on relevance, conditional on the stability of the channels that connect divine will to mortal life. Conditional, ultimately, on whether mortals keep telling the divine story as if it matters. This is why gods cultivate not only followers, but cultures. They sponsor kingdoms. They elevate priesthoods. They bless dynasties and curse heretics. They wage proxy wars through champions rather than risk direct exposure. Not because they are weak, but because they are careful. They have learned what happens when divinity becomes too near, too visible, too involved. The time of troubles left a scar. Closeness invites judgment, and judgment invites replacement. The spell plague and other arcane calamities left another. If the world's foundations convulse, faith convulses with them. So the gods fear mortals the way a king fears the mood of a crowded city on a hungry night. Not because one citizen can topple the throne, but because the crowd decides whether the throne has meaning. And in Faerun, meaning is power. A mortal's life is short. That is often spoken as weakness, but it is also the source of the most dangerous freedom in the realms. Mortals can change their minds quickly. They can abandon old loyalties in the face of new suffering. They can reinvent themselves. They can choose a new god when a new god offers a truth that fits their era. The gods are ancient. They move slowly. They gather worship over centuries. They rely on continuity. Mortals break continuity as easily as they breathe. That is why the gods watch mortal innovation with suspicion. Why they fear mortal empires that rewrite law and custom. Why they fear mortal mages who treat cosmic rules as puzzles. Why they fear mortal tyrants who can redirect worship with propaganda and terror. Why they fear mortal saints who can inspire a devotion so fierce it reshapes a faith's center of gravity. The gods are not afraid of mortals because mortals can swing a blade at the heavens. They are afraid because mortals can decide what the heavens are worth. In the end, the realms is not ruled by gods alone and not shaped by mortals alone. It is a tense, living exchange. Divinity offers power, and mortals answer with belief or with refusal. And that exchange is the one thing even the greatest gods cannot escape, because the gods may be eternal. But mortals decide which eternities survive.